Welcome everyone again to one in our series of managerial insights in supporting businesses during a rather uncertain time. Today we're joined by Doug Quackenbos. He is a lecturer and faculty member of the marketing department at the Dartmouth School of Business, and he's also a very important part of the executive education faculty team as well. This series is brought to you by Executive Education at the Dartmouth School of Business in association with our partners in this project, the South Carolina Business Review, and we have Mike Switzer with us at the moment, who you may have heard his voice over the radio waves in the mornings. He will be helping us with his questions, and you probably heard his radio show with Doug on that show a few days ago.
Thank you, Ray.
So today we are exploring with Doug the selling process in the post-COVID world. How is that affecting the way we think about selling and the sales process? And Doug will be presenting some ideas about that. At the end of that, we will have access to his PowerPoint presentation, and we will get that out to everybody that's registered for this as soon as the program is finished. And the recording of this, it will be recorded, will be made available in a few days' time. And that will be available on our social media platforms at the Dartmouth School, Executive Education, and so on. And please share them more widely with anyone you think will find it interesting. So with that, I have one more thing to say. Mike is here because he will be hosting the questions. So if you have any questions as we go along, please use the chat function, which you're going to find at the bottom of the screen. If you just scroll down there, you'll see the chat function. Chat in your question. Mike will pick it up, and Mike will host those questions to Doug for him to answer at the end of Doug's comments. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to hang over to you, Doug. Bye.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ray. Thanks for the chance to do this today. Thanks, Mike, for working with us as well, and the whole executive education team. I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts. I think this is quite an interesting time. I'm going to pull up my screen, if I may, and share with you some thoughts about selling in a post-COVID world. I assume you can see my screen there. Okay. So the full title being Selling in a Post-COVID World, Local and Global Implications. I know we've had this series discussing the impact of COVID. And I think the area of sales and selling is one that people think about in very different ways. So the first thing, I guess, that I would like to do, if you'll allow me, is to just do a quick primer on what I understand sales to be. And of course, there's lots of you who may have differing ideas slightly about it. Some people will generally refer to sales as the art of persuasion or the art and science of persuasion. But I think if we want to get specific, I like this list, and this is just, as I say, for a primer, so to speak. I like this list of the key selling tasks. I'm crediting here Anthony Iannarino and his 2017 book, The Only Sales Guy You'll Ever Need. And I really want to focus on these five. These five areas are the key things that I'm focusing on as I discuss in the coming slides, what I'm referring to about the job of sales. So one, closing, that is asking for and obtaining commitments. Of course, those of you who are fans of sales know Neil Rackham's spin selling, for example, kind of gets the idea of each time we move the process closer to close. Doesn't always have to be a close per se, but we have to move closer to that end. That's the closing process. Prospecting is all about opening up new relationships and creating opportunities, and that can be typically with customers who are not fully involved with the company. In other words, we call them prospects for that reason. Storytelling is the idea of how do we create and share a vision, and I'm referring typically to the process here again, not necessarily just the salesperson, but the selling task of telling a story about what we're trying to do. The one that many people think of is diagnosing, and that's often in the area of, for example, the challenger sale, how you understand your customers' needs. We'd often refer to the framework there of customer jobs, pains, and gains. So that's kind of what's involved in the diagnosing, just very quickly. And of course, negotiating being the idea of how do we create win-win deals between the two parties involved. There are other three that are there kind of laid it out for you are all more about the personal development of the salesperson and then management within it. So I'm leaving them out of this discussion for the most part, but we'll touch on them a little bit towards the end, but without going too deep into them. So just as a point of reference, that's where we start. I would like to then say, well, first of all, what I see happening, and I think many of you have seen this in your own businesses, is that most of what's happening is COVID really just accelerating, even hyper accelerating some of the trends that had already started. Specifically, and I'm going to go through this list quickly, is the automation of selling tasks. Now, those that I just referred to, we have things like chatbots, we have marketing automation, sales automation, AI creeping into the sales process a lot. We see this as we work with companies as consumers, and also perhaps in your own companies, you see this going on. It was already started. People recognize the need to do more of it now. Another one, I think, and a very important one, almost touche to the fact that we're all in a Zoom meeting right now, is this familiarity and comfort with virtual contact. I think it was said something like 10 million users was the average of Zoom, and I'm just using Zoom as an example, but of course there are plenty of other formats and platforms that we could use. But now, went from 10 million to over 300 million. So we have over 300 million users who are quite comfortable with this. Now, on top of that, I'm saying we use Zoom in place of face-to-face activities or visits. So if you're going to be in sales, we already knew that some people would pick up the phone with great regularity. Sometimes we would have a Zoom call, but for some reason, it seems like as soon as we weren't able to meet personally, we felt a need to jump into a Zoom call to replace that face-to-face meeting. So there's something going on there that's absolutely been accelerating because of this. There's been a pressure now on this idea for a long time that sales isn't just an art. You'll hear the cliche sometimes of an art and a science. It's both an art and a science. Well, the sales productivity requirement now is driving more sales process thinking. This has been going on for a long time. There's a lot of theories behind this that are, I think one of the best is Justin Rothmarsh when he talks about the machine. And this is the idea that we can take the sales process and break it up almost like a manufacturing type operation where there's a front end all the way through an assembly part. So if we take the process and say, what can be done at a lower cost and how can we do this in a more efficient way, just like we would, people start to think now more than ever of the need for productivity. Well, of course, with COVID, that's been accelerated to a significant extent. The idea of marketing and sales fusing has also been going on for quite some time. In fact, it's beginning to become hard sometimes to say what exactly is a sales function and what is a marketing function, because the two functions are so overlapping. There's always been areas of advertising and communication, and we know that that in fact is a part of sales. But now we even have social media, the ability to reach out, contact someone or make a contact with someone and find that they potentially could make a sale right off of our social media platform, or at least be directed to it. So it's hard to understand exactly where that goes in the future, but it certainly makes more sense as we put more attention on it. One of the negative trends that was already underway as well was this reduction of trade show participation, both by the suppliers to the industry and by people who would actually go, visitors, both industry veterans and people who might just be interested. So there's been a downward trend on that, and of course it's come to a complete standstill at this point with COVID. So that's an area that I think we'll come back to revisit because we're not sure how that'll play out. The struggle for the survival of brick and mortar retail has been going on for a long time. Many of us have lived this very closely as you see malls or areas around you struggle to keep those anchor stores in there. And we hear stories of Macy's shutting stores, or this was before COVID. So of course, with COVID, it's even accelerated more. So this is doing two things. Obviously, it's accelerating the need to understand how to buy online, but then also the need to how do you sell to organizations as a supplier and not a supplier to the retail level, but into other platforms. So that's another trend that's moving very quickly. And then there's definitely a move that has been going on for quite some time from the field to inside. And I think this is a fascinating term, even if you think about the word field sales, maybe you've all heard that term used, and it kind of is a bit of an anachronism in itself to say that someone, when they're not in the headquarters, they're in the field, as if they're somewhere out there beyond the office walls. Well, that made sense when there was a time for us to literally be out there because we couldn't contact them any other way. The word stuck through the entire development of all technology. But recently, and I say recently in the last 5 to 8 years especially, has been challenged more and more by the idea of sales development reps, business development reps, inside sales roles, that is bringing resources from outside inside to a centralized headquarters and putting everyone together to work there, maybe having a couple people out in the field. So obviously, with what's going on, we have all of the pressure to get people out into the inside roles and out of the field. Now they can't even often visit the customer. So all of these trends, I would say, were already underway, but they are accelerating because of the COVID issue. At the heart of this, of course, is this, I love this, this sentence or this idea, the meaningful selling conversation, right? Everyone at the end of a sales exercise really is hoping to get to the meaningful selling conversation. That is that specific point in time when you're able to talk to your interface and talk about something that really gets at the heart of what you're trying to do, if it's selling or if it's moving them to the next stage in the process, etc. So where does this go? And here I think some emerging questions that we have that have not been really put to the test yet is whether a face-to-face meeting is justified. And what I mean by that is a face-to-face in a Zoom context. Obviously, we do it all the time. We can understand that. But more than that, I mean knocking on your door, coming into your operation, talking to your people, and the question would have to be asked of why. What is so compelling that you would need to come and show me or be here in person? So this was already also under siege to some extent, and many people in sales recognize just how hard it is to get your customers to accept that you're going to come and visit. In fact, what often we want to get as salespeople is our customers' time, not to waste it, but to get their attention, of course, on something important, to Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Doug.
I'm sorry. I got cut out there somewhere.
I think you stopped just after the face-to-face and why.
Thank you. Apologize. My apologies for that. So the question then becomes how much support and how much self-serve should be going on in the process. This was already underway, and that is informed to some extent by the differences among age groups. We already know the way that people will use texting, for example, is very different among different demographics and cultures. So understanding how you would use these technology then is the next step that I think that sales rep, as they look into how to do their job, the virtual selling element. Do you use video? Is that an acceptable format? Text, of course, is always a questionable one, but some people love it. Email is a classic, and again, depending on your customer base, they may love that or not. Of course, we still have phones and social media. Should you visit? And then the question being, how does a company then re-engineer or restructure their sales organizations, both the roles and the teams within it, to get to where they can support the idea of getting to that meaningful selling conversation, which this, to a great extent, is the true essence of sales. So in that same vein, then there's, I think, things that are worth thinking about in terms of what talent and career considerations are involved when we think about the realities of a new environment that's everything we just saw or I just described. We know there's fewer jobs, unfortunately, because there was already greater automation, but now with the recessionary tendencies, fewer jobs, more candidates. There's greater geographic flexibility for both parties, which is a really interesting situation that could work positively in many ways, has some challenges, of course. That redefining of sales roles and responsibilities, how do you go about rewriting your job descriptions, especially when many people are accustomed to working a certain way? And again, some of this was going on, a lot of this was going on prior to COVID, of course, but what is different is kind of the recognition of remote as a way of life almost. Some major companies have now said they're going to allow their employees to work remote, and that obviously has some implications in terms of some people love that. They find it liberating, they find it exciting. Other people might find it isolating and that they're somehow not part of a team. And so that is a big issue. It also feeds into a question of the traditional career path. Typically, people would work in entry-level sales roles, whether it would be merchandising or sales development, and then they move up the career path, again, often an inside headquarter type environment where they can manage others. Well, the career path may be there, but obviously some differences around how the management or how the career growth will occur. And again, in that same sense, there will be training requirements to meet evolving customer needs. And I think even more importantly, expectations. Because what's really changing now to a great extent is that people's expectations around what can or cannot be completed by someone or some support to someone, that could be all of the sales automation tools that I was referring to earlier. There's significant changes going on in that sense as well, and many more people tethered to their seats during times of remote work. So expectations changing as well. The talk itself is, of course, titled Local and Global Implications, and I think it's worth thinking about where this goes from a global perspective. And here again, I think the key areas to think about are how do you justify this face-to-face in-person visit? Already we know there's logistics and travel complications around visas, for example, or maybe multiple country visits if you're going to travel throughout Asia or throughout Latin America, for example, from the United States or wherever, or go to multiple countries in Europe. You can imagine the complications that are involved in moving across borders now, depending on where the last country you visited, et cetera, was. So that will put an immediate extra question mark into that discussion. I think there's larger questions, though, that arise from this, and that's the cross-pollination that typically happens between sales and marketing teams in different countries. visit from a headquarter person can often be a great catalyst to share initiatives and ideas, and vice versa, bring ideas back from other markets. And some of that personal touch obviously will be gone. Zoom cannot replace that, or any kind of technological platform. So again, I think it's going to require some rethinking around what the sales roles and responsibilities are, because we won't be able to actually go and make that physical contact as easily. I don't think there's much of it going on at all right now in many places. So taking into account these cultural differences, that's that you could speak for days, of course, about the cultural differences across countries already with space and requirements and contact and everything else. I don't intend to go into that area right now, but suffice it to say that different cultures, geographically speaking, might have different expectations of how much contact they have, both with their own internal support team and with the customers who they visit. And therefore the materials and the way that the organization is structured may need to be localized a little bit to meet that need. Finally, I think it's important that we don't fall into the trap of kind of remote distancing, where not only do we not visit, but that we become a little distanced because we're not close enough in any events that overlap. So I think there's some global challenges, international challenges, that really are probably not obvious until you start to question how you can create those bridges anew with your internal and then at the local level interfaces. So just a couple thoughts then around the future. Where does all this go from here? I have some thoughts like that. I think we all might. Maybe there will be a backlash to so much virtual distancing. So I don't know that this is going to stick for a lot of people in a lot of industries. That is to say, some people really very much like that face-to-face contact and the ability to meet their suppliers on a regular basis. So will there be a need to say, let's come back together? I think one way that we might bridge that will be to have more trade shows where people can visit. Maybe the selling doesn't go on per se right there, but the ability to meet people in the industry will. So I think that's a significant possibility. It's too soon to know, because right now it's a big question mark as to how many people would want to, how many companies would want to expose their own employees to that kind of level of contact, and how many people would show up. But post-COVID, when we feel safe, perhaps that'll be one way that we'll rethink this. I think a big question for us in South Carolina that's a question mark, but could be very positive in my opinion, is the sales-focused organizations perhaps choosing to be based in South Carolina. I don't have any evidence to provide for this, except for that I think that it's the state of South Carolina is considered a nice place to be. And if we do have more of a remote environment, we certainly have the chance for both companies and individuals to decide to work from South Carolina. So those three thoughts lead to the kind of the final one, which would be, what would a second wave do in terms to the sales function? And could that really be the quote unquote true death of the field salesperson at that point? Is it going to be the end of the desire to see people go out and meet in a face-to-face environment? So I think these are some things to think about. I don't wish that, and I'm not sure that that's happening, but I do think that just like Arthur Miller's novel, there's kind of a thought behind all of this, that there are definite differences across the generations and across the demographic groups. So again, it's worth thinking about how that handoff goes from this more face-to-face environment to more of a virtual and well-managed, technologically enhanced sales process. So that's my presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions at this point. Hand it over to you, Mike.
All right, so thank you very much, Doug. I think I'm up and running here. So there we go. So yeah, I think this is a really important topic, and you brought a lot of good information to the table. I know that, you know, especially in the early weeks of this crisis, when people were so not only concerned, of course, about their health, their family and friends' health, customers and employees' health, then, you know, the business's health itself, and the whole sales part of everything, and how do I call these prospects now, and, you know, and try to convert them into customers when they've got all these things on their table too. So do you think now that we're entering into the 4th month of this experience that the fear of getting out there and prospecting and selling again has dissipated?
I think it's a great question. I do think there's some fatigue around the idea of I can't be with anybody. I think the real challenge, as I talk to people who are selling on a regular basis, is that regardless of how you do it, by bringing someone in, you're bringing someone in who you don't know who they last were with. In other words, so if you're on the customer end of the situation, you have to balance how much benefit does it bring to have this person come in to see me physically, and that means me and then the people around whom I work as well, assuming that that company is already back in their offices, right? And the alternative to that would be to say, let's meet at some place that's allowing social distancing for a dinner, and that seems even less likely in most cases. So even if the spirit's willing, the flesh may be weak ultimately to say, I can't see really why I would take that risk on. That's my concern, and that's what I hear from a lot of people. They want that contact, but a lot of times it's hard to justify even in their own organizations to say why we're having someone come in. Unless, now I want to clarify, we're not talking about technical support. We're not talking about someone who needs to come in to maintain or work on a machine or to help move material around. I'm talking specifically to that salesperson.
All right, let me remind everybody that if you have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Send that in and we will channel that on through to Doug. So Doug, has this whole new virtual selling marketing world that we're in now, it seems obvious, but has it really increased the value of having a good and up-to-date website, web presence?
Yeah, I think that as I referred earlier, these were trends that were already going on. I think the idea of self-service around products, you can think about it at a consumer level of, I don't think any among us would buy a car that we hadn't fully researched. I even often would argue that if you're going to buy a refrigerator, that's a great example that typically a refrigerator for your home, it's likely you will have done a decent amount of research, and you will likely have done it with other stakeholders in your home. It's not something that one just decides to go out and buy. So what does that look like? I visit different websites, I do my research, and then I contact a salesperson or an organization when I'm ready or close to thinking about buying. So in the business to business context, many statistics are thrown around, but it's usually somewhere well over 70% of the journey is done before the buyer or potential buyer contacts the company. So what we find is that process was well underway. So now I think it's just that much more important, coupled with these automated tools that are available to get to where you can have that meaningful selling conversation with a person. We still assume that's important, but yeah, the website's more important than ever as a part of that process.
And I guess the same goes for social media, because that, you know, for companies who really haven't used that for sales and marketing, that's probably something they need to start looking at.
Well, there's no question. I mean, I will say I am not our resident expert on social media, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But I do know from a sales context, obviously it kind of crosses the line between sales and marketing sometimes, what you can do through social media. The question for social media usage with a lot of customers, of course, is saturation. We've had so much of it. So again, often the idea from the selling perspective is, how do I get to that point where I have the customer with me in that conversation and I can get them to do more than just order? We're not talking about going on Amazon, which is obviously very important, and ordering something. I'm talking about maybe getting you to buy something better than what you thought, an upsell, or buying more than what you expected, a cross sell, right? This type of, how do I get to where I can have that contact at a personal level? And social media is a great way to get you there, but obviously not going to get you usually to the close.
Here's a question that has come in. What do you see as the optimal way or ways? Can you recommend some ways to present and close a sale virtually?
So it's a great question. And I'm working with other people in the industry around this. Much of Zoom, and again, I'm using Zoom as a proxy for all of the online platforms. Much of Zoom format is presentation. So that is as if I were presenting to my customers. And I think the question that's come in that you're referring to there is more about the one-on-one selling conversation. So I think the way you can do that, of course, is to have all of the information. The best way that you can do that is to have all of the information available in a couple different formats. Ideally, it will have been available to them through an email. Some of it's on your website as well. But to have your homework done as you meet with them, maybe you take some Excel spreadsheets, you can toggle back and forth between information that you can use your screen. If you think about it, it's an incredibly powerful tool that I could suddenly show you things that I want to show you that make sense. Say my task is to document savings, and I can say, by using my product, you're going to save 20% versus the competition. Let me quickly show you. Well, if I run an office environment, I'd have to pull out my computer or pull out. So I think to answer that question here, I think if you're prepared and you can toggle back and forth, that's one way you can probably move the ball more quickly. I think the other thing is to just remember there is a limit on the amount of time that you're going to get, because in a face-to-face, there's a lot of the pleasantries. And when in the virtual setting, you just don't have that. So you miss the before and the after often. And some of the best practices that we're seeing emerge right now is the use of mobile telephone or iPhone, whatever you want to call it, whatever your platform is, quick videos. So perhaps you visited a customer with a Zoom call or whatever, and then maybe you do something a little less formal as a follow-up. Hey, Mike, what you and I talked about, I just want to follow up on that. And it's just a quick video that I shot, almost as a courtesy call, as a follow-up. That's a way that we're seeing a lot of people respond quite well to a post-Zoom kind of meeting to close afterwards.
And the next question that came in is pretty much along those same lines. So if there's anything you want to add, he asks, are certain sales tactics or practices better suited for the virtual sales world? And then his follow-up is, does this virtual environment speed up or slow down the sales cycle?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We've thought a lot about that. I think, to me, the question is getting at that meaningful selling conversation. If I'm going to be on a call simply, or a Zoom call, a virtual call, simply to walk my prospect or customer through what they could do on their own, chances are that's probably not the best use of that time. So that's why I say, I think it's going to shrink the window of time, because it doesn't feel as natural. It's not like we can go walk to the coffee shop together and continue talking, because here we are on a Zoom call. So I think that the best thing is to have all of that information prepared, as I said before, and be ready to use different formats to reach in different ways. The other benefit that I will add, since it is a similar question, is if you can contact other people in the buying process, this also makes that a little easier. It makes it a little more complex, but at the same time, it's easier if someone you know is a stakeholder in that decision and you can contact them. You can have a meeting that's less intrusive than it might be if you were to say, I'm going to come and visit your colleague in another area. Now, as to whether that speeds up or slows down the process, it's a great question. I think the jury's out on that. I think the idea of people still like often to know who they're doing business with in a physical way. Most of us still prefer that. So in that context, this could speed it up, because if they don't have that option, but they need to make the decision, well, they have to go forward anyway, because they've got to get their job done. Remember, when we're in sales, we're always thinking if the customer has a job to be done. So ideally, my solution is going to meet that. It could slow it up, I think, if you're clunky in your presentation, or if you're slow in the way that you you meet with them or don't use the right technology at the right time. But the jury's out. It's a very good question.
And let me remind everybody that if you have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Just hover your mouse over the bottom there and the chat function will come up. Send some questions in. We'll get those over to Doug while we have time. Now, Doug, you mentioned training as, sales training as becoming a lot more important now with all these changes going on. Are there companies that specialize in virtual sales training?
There's one called Sales Gravy in Georgia that's pretty good at this type of training. There are other companies. I'm not a member of those companies. I'll put my disclaimer. I don't have any interest in them educationally or financially. So I can't speak to any that are specifically designed on virtual versus sales in general, but your classic sales companies recognize that sales training companies recognize that the process is the same. I think the question is how technology is integrated into this process. And training, what I'm referring to in the slide that I showed, is that I think it's a lot around expectations. As I mentioned before, when a person is contacted, suddenly they might expect that people at the company would know more than in the past. They might have thought, well, my sales rep should know that. Now I'm in this world where everybody's there all the time, or seemingly they're there all the time. And I talk to someone, I see a similarity in some of the student expectations and because everything's online, they assume that everything is always there. So I think the training would be to help people understand how to manage those expectations and to find the right information, and to recognize that likely this process is going to go a long time. I'm referring to the process of from the time the customer's thinking about buying to all the way through to making that purchase. And then should that be more of a customer service function, or should it be an actual selling function beyond customer service?
And how do you see artificial intelligence coming into this equation? Do you see AI in the sales process even more now?
Well, yeah, again, a fun area to think about. And I'm not an expert on AI, but I've seen a lot, even in my time teaching, of development and growth of functionality with AI. So a question that I'll often ask my students is to think of those 5 hard skills that I referred to: prospecting, diagnosing, closing, negotiating. All of these processes, including storytelling, of course, which we covered to a great extent on the website. How many of those can be done with technology? And if you think about that, it's pretty hard to say that any of them, with the exception maybe of high quality diagnosing, high-end, high quality, high value add diagnosing, even a lot of that is just the frequently asked troubleshooting kind of questions. So yes, AI is learning, it's being incorporated into this process. And increasingly we find that companies are anticipating better what their customers need, and they're moving them very, very, very far through the process to where all that's left are those exceptions or little areas around the edges. So I think that's why I keep coming back to the idea of getting to that meaningful selling conversation is the key to having success if you're going to sell. Everything else that can be automated ultimately should be automated. That would be my recommendation on that.
And can you address the etiquette involved in these video sales calls? For example, is it okay to go ahead and record it without a disclosure to the participants, or do you need to always disclose it? Any other etiquette points you can give us?
Yeah, great area. I really think this is evolving. I don't think that there's standard practices yet around this. I would never recommend recording something that you don't tell your customer that you're recording, obviously. And I would hope that they would have that same level of respect both ways. I would make anything available if I did record it with them and send it to them. But I do think, to your point, to your question, there's a lot of development going on even as we speak around what should the background, how should you be framed as you're presenting? because when we have a company culture, you often have an expectation that the company's culture is your professional persona. You work for a company. Suddenly now you might be presenting from your home office. And how much do you, what should you allow other people to see about your home office or your environment? So there's a lot of discussion around that area about how we professionalize that. And then of course, the other question is this kind of like a shades of gray question. If we take that to an extent where we say, well, let's just put our corporate logo behind us now, and we use a standard Zoom backdrop, then we get to the situation where, well, why are we on a Zoom call at all? Why don't we just pick up the phone and talk to each other? So there's kind of a point where we're trying to emulate this personal exchange. And I think all of the things that you would do in a meeting in face-to-face, if you took minutes in that meeting, you would share the minutes or notes with your customer. The same etiquette would happen here, and the agreements would be recapped. In some ways, it generates more work than before.
Well, Doug, I think that's the last question. We can go ahead and wrap it up. If you do have one while we're doing the wrap up, feel free to use the chat function down there and submit another question. Our next installment in this series is this Wednesday, June 24th. The South Carolina Business Review radio show will be happening at 10 till 8 in the morning across South Carolina's 8 public radio stations. And of course, it's available online anytime as a podcast. Our guest will be Dr. Deborah Hazard, who will talk about diversity and inclusion, certainly a hot topic these days with the recent issues with police actions. But of course, our main focus will be on the pandemic and what opportunities that she sees for organizations to increase that diversity and inclusion. And so that is this Wednesday morning on the South Carolina Business Review. And so I guess I don't see any other questions coming in, so I guess we're good, Doug, and we can turn it back over to Ray Smith.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much, Doug. Here's my background. Sorry I didn't call in. Thank you very much for that. I thought that was very helpful, very clear. I thought the answers were very practical as well and useful to people. And I'm sure this is a really big need that many organizations face, is what do we do in this crazy social world that we live in at the moment, brought about by the COVID thing. So thank you for that. But thank you also for keeping calm and carrying on when we lost you for a while. And thank you, Liz, for actually bringing that back on and bringing us all back together again. As you heard from Mike, next week we will be having Professor Deborah Hazard, who is the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Dartmouth School of Business. And she will be addressing the issues that Mike described. Very, very germane and very important to us in this time. So I hope you'll be able to join us. As I said before, this has been recorded. It will be available in a couple of days when we have the subtitles on. And please share that as widely as you can. I'm sure if you have any questions for Doug, you could reach out to us in Executive Education or directly through to Doug, and we'd be happy to answer them.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening, and see you next week.